The communication process is really important for us to study because it helps us look at how communication happens and how we might be able to be more effective communicators with one another. Something that your book doesn't talk too much about, but that I think is really important, is how the model of communication and how we understand the communication process has actually evolved over time. So I'm going to just briefly walk you through three particular moments in the history of the communication model that I think are pretty interesting and reveal a lot about how we study communication and why. So one of the models for communication originated in the early 1940s. And if you look at your screen, you're going to see the components that are still familiar to you that you've read about in chapter 1, which, we see a linear model. We see that there's a source. So right now that source is me, I'm talking, right? And there's a receiver. And right now that receiver is you because you're listening to my message. And my message is the content of what's being said. So right now that message is, here is the communication model. Let me explain this to you, right? And the channel is the medium of how that message is being communicated. So right now it's through virtual means. If we were in a classroom, it would be face-to-face. And then we see around this particular linear model of communication the concept of noise, which in its early iteration meant quite literally environmental noise. So thinking about wherever you are right now, if there are children that you can hear in the background, or maybe your dog's barking, or a cat meowing, or a dishwasher running, or if you're in an apartment, maybe you hear music from one of the other apartments nearby, or cars going by a home. Any of those things are environmental noise. Now, what's really interesting about this model is if you think about the 1940s, we're in World War II, right? And Hitler is someone that has long been studied and understood as someone who was a very skilled communicator. He was very powerful in his use of communication. And that's actually reflected in the way that people were thinking about the power of communication. If you look at this model, it's very linear. It's very one way. It's like the source gives a message and it gets lumped down on a receiver, and that's it. And that, in fact, is part of the fear of communication or rhetoric, which, rhetoric has many definitions, but one of them is that it's strategic public communication. And if you think about the way that the word rhetoric is understood and used in society, even today, people tend to use it in the political sphere as something that is manipulative or tricky, right? And so similarly, we're seeing this idea in this particular model that communication is something that happens to someone. So maybe there's not that much agency or ability to respond. And that's why later in the 40s, scholars developed communication as interaction, which is a really empowering move. So we see the same model on the slide here, but we see two new concepts, and probably one of the most important is feedback. So communication isn't something that just happens to you. You have opportunities to provide feedback, right, to a particular sender of a message. So that reflects some change and growth in how we understand the communication process. Additionally, you'll see this context or situation, which again gives us another layer to understand why messages might be framed in a particular way. How you communicate in a business setting is going to be different than how you communicate in an interpersonal context. If the context of a situation is celebratory, that's going to provide different communication options for you than if a context is very serious, right? So thinking about the context, how long have we known each other? What is the setting? Is it a funeral? Is it a birthday party? Is it a professional meeting? All of those things are going to dictate the kind of communication that takes place in that process. Finally, we see communication as simultaneous transaction. This is the model that your book presents, and this is the one that I would like you to know for our class. And you'll notice a couple things here. One is that we kind of get rid of the idea of sender and receiver, and we do something really fun, which is we just call the people involved communicators. And what that does is it really breaks down the understanding that communication is one way or linear, and instead celebrates the fact that we are all always communicating. So it's not about you waiting for your turn to speak. You are processing information. When we're face to face, you're giving nonverbal cues back to the person who's talking, and they're giving nonverbal cues to you while you're talking. And you'll also notice that for each communicator in this model, there's that pink box that says encodes and decodes. And I love this concept because encoding is right now, as I'm trying to explain this communication model to you, I'm encoding a message in my head. So my experiences and my expertise are helping shape how I frame this message to you. And similarly, you're decoding the message. So your experiences and your expertise are filtering through that message that I'm sending to you, and you're thinking about, do I agree or disagree with this? Does this resonate with my experiences? So we're constantly encoding and decoding through our particular lenses, and we'll get a little bit more into this in chapter 2 too, as we think about how people are interpreting different messages based off of their cultural identities and their perspectives and experiences. And then I also want you to notice that noise has taken a much more prominent position in this model than in the previous ones. And that's because we start to distinguish that there are different kinds of noise and that they can really impede how we perceive messages. So as I mentioned before, we have the environmental noise, right? We have physiological noises, and then we also have psychological noises. So psychological noises can be positive or negative, but they're the things that we're thinking and feeling in any given moment. So if you're watching this video after work, but before dinner, you might be thinking about your day and also thinking about how you're hungry and what you're going to cook for dinner. If you're watching this video before the weekend starts, trying to finish one more assignment, then you might be thinking ahead about the good plans that you have over the weekend, right? So that's a short evolution of some of how we've established a communication model, and I hope it helps you think about the communication process.